At my son's funeral, his wife threw me out of my own house. I'm Andrew Pierce, 65 years old, and what happened next changed everything. Picture this. Your child just died. You're grieving, and your daughter-in-law looks you in the eye and says, "Stop crying, pack your bags and get out of my house now." She called me a worthless burden in front of everyone at my son's funeral. But here's what Caroline didn't know. The house she was kicking me out of? I built it in 1987. The money she thought she inherited? $850,000 that was always mine. For 8 years, she lived off my generosity while treating me like charity. Instead of arguing, I just walked away. Sometimes silence is the most powerful response of all. But what Caroline discovered 3 days later taught both of us that assumptions can cost you everything. Trust me. But you'll want to see how this ends, because fraud has consequences, and the police were about to teach her that lesson personally. Let me start from the beginning. The signs were there from day one. I just chose to ignore them. When my son Brian died in that car accident 2 months ago, Caroline immediately took charge. "Don't worry about the arrangements, Andrew," she said. "I'll handle everything." What she really meant was stay out of my way. At the funeral home, she made every decision. The casket, the flowers, even the music. When I suggested Brian's favorite song, the one we used to play when we built this house together in 1987, she cut me off. "That's too depressing," Caroline said. "We need something more uplifting." I watched her command the room in her $300 black dress, directing everyone like she was the director of this tragic play. And me? I sat in my old gray suit, the one I'd worn to my wife Elizabeth's funeral 2 years earlier, feeling invisible. As the funeral service itself was a blur of faces and words that felt hollow. Caroline sat in the front row, accepting condolences like she was the only one who'd lost someone important. I sat 2 seats away, watching strangers shake her hand and offer their sympathies. "Brian was so lucky to have you," I heard one woman say. "You're handling this so well." What they didn't know was that Caroline had been handling everything for the past 2 months, not just the funeral arrangements, but my life too. She'd started small. "Andrew, I'll take care of the bills this month. You just focus on grieving." Then it was, "Andrew, I'll handle the insurance paperwork. These things are complicated." Before I knew it, she was answering my phone calls and making decisions about my daily routine. The second sign came during the reception at our house. My house, technically, though Caroline had been treating it like hers since Brian's death. She pulled me aside in the kitchen, while guests filled their plates with sandwiches and casseroles that neighbors had brought over. "Andrew, we need to talk about your situation." "My situation?" "You're financially dependent on us now. Brian was supporting you, and with him gone..." She shrugged. "I can't carry that burden." Burden. That word hit harder than expected. I'd been called many things in my 65 years, but never a burden. Not by my wife Elizabeth, not by my son Brian, not by anyone who mattered. "I've been more than generous letting you stay here," she continued. "But this house is mine now. Everything is mine. Brian left it all to me." I nodded slowly. Caroline saw that nod as defeat. What she didn't see was calculation. She had no idea that Brian had never owned this house. He lived here, yes. Grew up here, absolutely. But owned it? Never. She also didn't know about the filing cabinet in the basement. 4 drawers of meticulously organized financial records going back 40 years. This retired engineer never threw anything away. But the funeral guests saw what Caroline wanted them to see. A successful real estate agent taking charge during a family crisis, and an old man who couldn't handle his own affairs. They watched her shake hands and accept condolences like she was the head of the family now. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in Brian's old recliner, the one I'd bought him for his 16th birthday, and listened to her paint me as the dependent father-in-law. Andrew's having a hard time adjusting, I heard her tell our neighbor Diana Roberts. The poor man doesn't understand finances. Brian handled everything for him. Diana shot me a sympathetic look. She'd known me for 37 years, since the day I broke ground on this lot. But even she seemed to believe Caroline's version of reality. That's when I realized something important. People see what they expect to see. Caroline expected to see a grieving widower who couldn't manage on his own. So that's what she saw. The old Honda Civic I drove, instead of something flashy. The simple clothes I wore instead of expensive suits. The quiet way I handled my grief instead of making a show of it. She mistook humility for helplessness, quiet for weak, generous for desperate. It was an understandable mistake. I'd spent 2 years since Elizabeth's death living simply. No need for expensive toys or status symbols when you're learning to live alone. Brian understood that. He respected my choice to downsize my lifestyle. But Caroline measured worth by appearance, by volume, by who controlled the conversation. As the last guests left that Tuesday evening, Caroline cornered me by the front door. The house had grown quiet except for the sound of her heels clicking on the hardwood floors I'd installed by hand 37 years ago. I meant what I said, Andrew. This arrangement isn't working anymore. I looked around the living room I'd painted 3 times over the decades. The crown molding I'd measured and cut with Brian when he was 12. The built-in bookshelves where Elizabeth had displayed her collection of mystery novels. I understand, I said quietly. But Caroline had no idea what I understood. And she definitely had no idea what was coming next. Wednesday morning brought clarity and coffee in equal measure. I sat at my kitchen table, the one Elizabeth and I had bought at a garage sale in 1986, and made a list. Not of what I was losing, but of what Caroline thought she was gaining. The house. 2,400 square feet of memories on Maple Street in suburban Cleveland. Current market value, according to Caroline's own real estate expertise, $420,000. The life insurance, Brian's policy through his engineering firm, $150,000. Caroline had already started spending that money in her head. I could see it in her eyes when she talked about updating the house, about fresh starts and new beginnings. She'd given me 30 days. 30 days to find somewhere else to live on what she assumed was Social Security, and nothing else. The night before, she'd handed me a printed timeline. Actually printed it out like I was a tenant getting evicted. November 15th, she'd said, pointing to the date circled in red. That gives you time to find a nice senior community somewhere more appropriate for your situation. Your situation. There was that phrase again. She'd used it 4 times during our conversation, like my entire life could be summarized in those 2 words. I've already looked into a few places, she'd continued, pulling out brochures like she was doing me a favor. Sunset Manor has openings. It's only $800 a month for a studio apartment. $800 a month? She expected me to spend my entire Social Security check on rent and somehow survive on nothing else. What about food? I'd asked. Transportation? Medical bills? She'd shrugged. There are programs for people in your situation. Food stamps, Medicaid. The government takes care of senior citizens. The government? Like I was some charity case who'd never contributed anything to society. But here's what really bothered me. It wasn't the money, or even the house. It was how she was erasing everything. Caroline was systematically removing every trace of the life Elizabeth and I had built here. She'd already boxed up Elizabeth's photos from the mantel. Too depressing, she'd explained when I asked about them. Brian's childhood drawings were gone from the refrigerator. Even my old engineering certificates had disappeared from the den wall. I'm redecorating, she'd said. Brian always said this place needed updating. Updating? as if 40 years of memories were outdated software that needed to be replaced. But sitting there Wednesday morning with my coffee and my growing anger, I had a different realization. Caroline had made one critical assumption: that Brian owned everything she was claiming. She'd been married to him for 8 years. She'd lived in this house for 8 years. Well, she'd probably never seen a deed or a mortgage statement or any document that proved ownership of anything. Why would she? In her mind, the man handles the finances. Old-fashioned, maybe, but that's how she saw it. Except Brian had never actually handled my finances. He'd helped me around the house, sure. Brought groceries when I needed them. Drove me to doctor appointments after Elizabeth died. But the money, the investments, the property, that was always mine to manage. Caroline saw David's helpfulness and assumed dependency. She saw my gratitude and assumed obligation. Thursday morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went down to the basement. The basement had always been my sanctuary. Elizabeth used to joke that I was like a squirrel down there, storing away every document and receipt like they were acorns for winter. You never know when you'll need proof of something, I'd tell her. She'd roll her eyes and remind me that normal people didn't keep 40 years of bank statements. But I wasn't normal people. I was an engineer who'd learned early that paper trails tell stories, and stories protect you when memories fail or people lie. The filing cabinet stood exactly where I'd left it. 4 drawers of careful organization, each drawer labeled by decade. Each file folder labeled by category. Each document filed chronologically. It was beautiful in its own way, the precision of an engineering mind applied to record keeping. I pulled out the bottom drawer first. 1980s. The decade that changed everything. Inside, I found the folder I was looking for. Real estate, 447 Maple Street. The first document was the original land purchase agreement. March 12, 1987. Andrew Pierce, buyer. $43,000 for the lot. The second document was the construction contract. $78,000 for a custom colonial. I remembered every detail of that negotiation. The builder had wanted to use cheaper materials, but I'd insisted on quality. This house needs to last, I'd told him. I'm building it for my family. The third document was the most important. The original deed, recorded March 15, 1987. Owner, Andrew Pierce. No co-signer, no joint ownership, no mortgage. I'd paid cash for everything. Caroline had no idea, of course. She'd been 4 years old in 1987, probably learning to tie her shoes while I was learning to read blueprints. But there was more in that folder. Much more. Insurance policies, property tax receipts, utility connection agreements. All in my name, all paid by me, all proving continuous ownership for 37 years. Brian's name appeared nowhere in any of these documents. Nowhere. I pulled out the second drawer. 1990s. More of the same. Property taxes paid annually by Andrew Pierce. Insurance premiums paid quarterly by Andrew Pierce. Even the landscaping receipts were in my name. The 2000s drawer told the same story, and the 2010s. But the real surprise was in the very back of the bottom drawer. I'm in a folder labeled Trust Documents, Private. This was the folder Caroline definitely didn't know about. Inside were papers that would change everything. The first paper was a trust agreement dated June 15, 1985, before Brian was even born. The Andrew and Elizabeth Pierce Family Trust. The second paper was a bank statement from First National Bank of Ohio. Current balance as of October 31, 2024, $853,412. The trust was complicated, the way these things always are, but the basic structure was simple. Elizabeth and I were the original trustees. After Elizabeth's death, I became the sole trustee. Brian received monthly allowances for education, housing assistance, and family support, but ownership always remained with the trust, which meant it remained with me. Brian had lived comfortably because I made sure he lived comfortably. The engineering degree I helped pay for, the wedding I helped fund, and the various investments and opportunities that came his way, all of it flowed from this trust. Caroline saw Brian's comfortable lifestyle and assumed he was independently wealthy. She never imagined that the money flowing from Brian to me was actually my own money flowing back home. It's funny how assumptions work. You see what fits your expectations and ignore what doesn't. Carolyn expected successful young couples to support their aging parents. So when she saw Brian helping me, she assumed dependency. She never considered the possibility that I was helping him. But there was one more document in that folder. One that would matter most when the time came for truth-telling. Brian's life insurance policy. $150,000, just like Caroline said. But the beneficiary wasn't Caroline. The beneficiary was the Andrew and Elizabeth Pierce Family Trust, which meant the beneficiary was me. Caroline had been spending money that was never hers to begin with, making plans with resources that belonged to someone else, building a future on a foundation that didn't exist. I closed the filing cabinet and headed back upstairs. In the kitchen, I made myself a sandwich and thought about timing. Caroline had given me until November 15th to move out. Today was November 1st. That gave me exactly 2 weeks to decide how to handle this situation. I could call her right now, explain the truth, show her the documents, watch her world collapse in real time. Or I could wait. Let her keep making assumptions. Let her dig the hole deeper. Let her learn the lesson the hard way. As I ate my sandwich, I remembered something my old business partner used to say. Andrew, sometimes the best strategy is letting the other guy talk himself into a corner. Caroline was definitely talking herself into a corner. The question was, how deep did I want to let her dig before I stopped her? That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. And Caroline's purse was sitting on the counter, partially open. I shouldn't have looked, but something caught my eye. Papers. Official-looking papers with my name on them. I pulled them out carefully. What I saw made my blood pressure spike. Loan applications. Multiple loan applications. All in my name. My social security number, my address, even what looked like my signature. But I'd never signed these documents. I'd never applied for any loans. Caroline had been forging my signature. I spread the papers out on the kitchen table. $50,000 home equity line of credit against 447 Maple Street. $25,000 personal loan using my social security number. Credit card applications in my name with this address. All approved, all active, all generating debt that Caroline was planning to saddle me with. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found next. Insurance claim forms, filed 3 days after Brian's death, listing Caroline as the primary beneficiary of his life insurance policy. But she'd lied to the insurance company, claiming she was entitled to benefits that legally belonged to the trust. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was criminal fraud, identity theft, insurance fraud, wire fraud. Carolyn hadn't just assumed she could take what wasn't hers. She'd actively committed crimes to make it happen. I sat in that kitchen for a long time, looking at the evidence of Caroline's deception. She'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months. While I was grieving my son's death, she was systematically stealing my identity and my assets. Friday morning, I called Grace Patterson, my attorney for 20 years. Grace, I need more than just property law help. I need criminal law help. Within an hour, I was sitting in her office with a different kind of lawyer. someone who specialized in financial crimes. His name was Richard Hawkins, and he'd been prosecuting fraud cases for the state attorney's office for 15 years. "Mr. Pierce," Richard said, spreading Caroline's forged documents across his desk. "What you're describing is identity theft, insurance fraud, and attempted property fraud. These are federal crimes. Serious federal crimes." Grace leaned forward. "Andrew, this goes way beyond a family property dispute. Caroline could be looking at 10 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts." "What do I need to do?" I asked. "We file a police report immediately," Richard said. "Then we contact the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. They'll want to interview you and examine all the evidence. The fraudulent loan applications alone are enough to trigger a federal investigation." That afternoon, I found myself in the Cleveland Police Department, sitting across from Detective Maria Santos. She was about my age, a woman who understood what it meant to work hard your whole life and build something worth protecting. "Mr. Pierce," she said, taking my statement, "we see this more and more. Our family members thinking they can just take what belongs to older relatives. The law doesn't see it that way. Neither do I." Detective Santos was thorough. She photographed every document, took detailed notes about Caroline's behavior since Brian's death, and asked pointed questions about the timeline of her deception. "Has she had access to your personal documents?" she asked. "She's been living in my house for 8 years. She's had access to everything." "Any joint accounts? Joint credit cards?" "No, nothing like that. But she's been handling bills and paperwork since Brian died. I trusted her to help me during my grieving period." Detective Santos nodded grimly. "That's when these predators strike. They wait until you're vulnerable. Then they take advantage of your trust." The word predators hit hard, but it was accurate. Carolyn hadn't just made assumptions about my finances. She'd actively hunted them. She'd seen an opportunity in my grief and seized it. "What happens next?" I asked. "We execute a search warrant on her belongings. We'll find more evidence. People like this never commit just one crime. Then we arrest her and let the federal prosecutors decide what charges to file." As I left the police station, I felt something I hadn't felt since Brian's funeral. Clarity. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point anymore. This was about justice. Caroline had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The quiet man was about to speak up. And when quiet men finally speak through the proper legal channels, criminals learn the hard way that some lessons cost everything. Monday morning brought the confrontation Caroline never saw coming. She walked into my kitchen with her manila folder, ready to continue her eviction proceedings. I was sitting at the table with my own folder, but mine contained something she hadn't expected. "Andrew, we need to discuss the timeline for your move," she said, settling into the chair across from me like she owned the place, which in her mind, she did. "Actually, Caroline, we need to discuss something else entirely." I set down my coffee cup and pulled out my folder. "We need to talk about fraud." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I spread the documents across the table one by one. Property deed, trust papers, bank statements. Then I added the photocopies of her forged loan applications. "We need to talk about identity theft. We need to talk about insurance fraud. We need to talk about the police report I filed on Friday." Carolyn stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Her confident real estate agent demeanor cracked for the first time since Brian's funeral. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Brian had money, good money. He was an engineer." "Brian was comfortable because I made sure he was comfortable," I said quietly. "You've been living off my generosity for 8 years while planning to steal everything I built." The kitchen was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Caroline looked around like she was seeing it for the first time. The cabinets I'd chosen, the countertops I'd installed, the windows I'd measured and ordered, my house, my kitchen, my choice. Andrew, I didn't know, she whispered. You didn't ask. But worse than that, you tried to commit fraud when you thought you could get away with it. I pointed to the loan applications. These have my forged signature. You used my social security number to apply for credit lines against my property. You filed false insurance claims listing yourself as the beneficiary. Caroline's hands were shaking now. I can explain. You can explain it to the FBI. That's when we heard the car doors outside. 2 police officers walked up to my front door, just like Detective Santos had promised. Caroline saw them through the kitchen window, and what little color remained in her face disappeared completely. "Carolyn Pierce?" the first officer said when I opened the door. He was a young man, probably Brian's age, with kind eyes but a serious expression. "You're under arrest for identity theft, insurance fraud, and attempted financial fraud." They read her rights right there in my kitchen, the kitchen she'd planned to remodel with money that was never hers, the same kitchen where she'd called me a burden just days before. As they handcuffed her, Caroline turned back to me with desperation in her eyes. "Andrew, can we work something out? Some kind of arrangement?" I watched from my front door as they put her in the police car. My neighbor Diana was watching from her yard, along with several other neighbors who'd heard Caroline's version of events over the past 2 months. The woman who'd been so confident at Brian's funeral, so certain of her inheritance, so dismissive of the old man's protests, was now learning what consequences look like. Diana walked over after the police car drove away. "Andrew, what just happened?" "Justice," I said simply. The next morning, Carolyn's arrest made the local newspaper. Real estate agent charged with multiple counts of fraud. Her employer terminated her that afternoon. The state licensing board opened an investigation that would permanently revoke her license. But the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later, when Caroline's attorney called to arrange a plea deal. She would serve 18 months in federal prison, pay full restitution for the attempted fraud, and be permanently barred from working in financial services. The fraudulent loans would be voided, and the insurance company would process Brian's policy correctly, with the trust as the rightful beneficiary. 3 weeks after that, I sat in my living room reading the Sunday paper when the doorbell rang. Caroline stood on my porch, but she looked different, smaller somehow, humbled. She was wearing a simple gray dress instead of her usual expensive clothes, and her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look younger. "Andrew, I came to apologize, and to return something." She handed me a cardboard box. Photos of Brian when he was little, some of Elizabeth's recipe cards, things that belonged to you. I opened the door wider. "Come in." We sat in the quiet for a moment. Caroline looked around the room she'd planned to renovate. "It looks the same," she said. "Some things don't need changing." "Andrew, I owe you more than an apology. I was wrong about everything. About you, about the money, about what Brian meant when he helped you around the house. I made assumptions, and then I made choices that were criminal." I nodded. "We all make assumptions, Caroline. The difference is what we do when we learn we're wrong. I'm moving to Columbus after I serve my time. Fresh start. New city. And maybe I can do better there." "I hope you can." She stood to leave, then turned back. "Andrew, can I ask you something?" Of course. If I'd been respectful from the beginning, if I'd asked questions instead of making demands, would things have been different? I thought about that. Probably. I would have helped you transition to independence, given you time to find your feet. We might have found a way to honor Brian's memory together instead of fighting over it. I guess respect really isn't negotiable, is it? No, it's not. After she left, I opened the box she'd brought. Brian's baby pictures, Elizabeth's handwritten recipes, small treasures that had somehow ended up in the wrong hands during those chaotic weeks after the funeral. I thought about the past 3 months, the funeral, the confrontation, the criminal charges, the natural consequences. Caroline had learned an expensive lesson about assumptions and respect. But I'd learned something too. I'd learned that quiet strength doesn't mean silent acceptance of criminal behavior. I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth and let the justice system handle the consequences of other people's choices. Brian would have been proud of that lesson. Elizabeth would have approved of the methodical way I'd handled it. And me? I was at peace, sitting in the house I built, surrounded by the memories I'd protected, knowing that some things are worth fighting for. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age or your quiet nature, remember this. Quiet doesn't mean weak. It just means you choose your battles carefully. And when you finally speak up through the proper channels, smart people listen. Sometimes the best response to disrespect is simply proving them wrong. And sometimes justice comes knocking at their door. In life, the people who underestimate you often end up teaching you exactly how strong you really are, and teaching themselves exactly how weak their assumptions were. The difference between a wise man and a fool isn't how much they own or how loud they speak. It's knowing when to stay quiet and when to let the truth do the talking.